Everybody, and welcome to today's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on promoting labor rights in the cut flower industry. I extend a special welcome to our outstanding panel of witnesses, three of whom are testifying virtually from Colombia, Illinois, and Canada. Flowers have an emotional resonance in American society. They convey happiness, care, and love. They help to mark our most significant holidays and rituals. Many consumers want to ensure that the flowers they purchase for their loved ones are produced ethically in ways that protect workers and the environment. My district in Massachusetts includes many small farms, including flower farmers who provide specialty varieties and beautiful blooms that are hard to ship internationally. During my annual tour of farms in my district, I hear from farmers who work hard to produce flowers using environmentally sustainable methods and good labor practices, like Maya Nyack of Tip Top Orchard in Buckland, Massachusetts. My conversations with Maya about the challenges small farmers like her face in competing with large producers around the world who don't always share the same commitment to sound labor practices and human rights stuck with me. It is one of the reasons I wanted to hold today's hearing, to dig into the issue a little bit more. In the past few decades, most flower production has moved abroad. The United States is now the largest importer of cut flowers in the world, representing $2 billion and 36% of all global imports in 2023. Imports from other countries, especially of roses, chrysanthemums, carnations, and lilies, account for about 85% of the flowers sold in this country. In producing countries, flowers represent an important source of economic opportunity. As a labor-intensive industry, it provides jobs and livelihoods. The flower industry can be a source of economic empowerment, especially for women. In Colombia, for example, the top exporter to the U.S., women make up about 68% of the cut flower workforce. With U.S. dollars driving much of the global flower trade, we need better transparency about the labor practices, environmental impact, and potential human rights violations that are involved in production. Gaps in labor protections and attacks on collective bargaining rights for unions by companies and by governments can lead to exploitation and harm for vulnerable workers. While companies have launched promising initiatives of corporate social responsibility, some of which we will hear about today, it is not enough to rely on self-regulation or voluntary compliance with international standards. Effective regulation and oversight from the governments of producing and importing countries is critical to ensure the protection of worker rights. We want to ensure that workers themselves have the ability to organize, build unions and democratic coalitions, and exercise collective power to advocate for their own rights. Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes the right to just and favorable conditions of work, equal pay for equal work without discrimination, and the right to form and join trade unions. These are basic human rights that are too often violated when there are insufficient protections in place to hold companies accountable. In this hearing, we will examine the human rights of workers and producer communities affected by the global cut flower industry. We will focus on the top flower exporting countries of Colombia, Ecuador, Kenya, and the Netherlands. But conditions in the cut flower industry in these countries also have implications for the social and economic rights of workers in other countries and in other industries. Today's conversation can inform U.S. policy recommendations across a range of agricultural and trade contexts. We hope to hear witnesses discuss best practices for preventing human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, and violence against women in the cut flower industry. We welcome recommendations for how Congress can promote policies to protect against these types of violations. It is important that we listen, because Congress can make a difference, I believe. During negotiations of the 2012 U.S.-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement, My colleagues and I in Congress insisted that human rights and labor protections be elevated. As a result, the two countries agreed on a labor action plan that laid out concrete steps and commitments by Colombia to improve worker rights, address impunity, and protect union members. This was an important foundation, although it can go further in assuring the ability of workers to organize freely and exercise collective power. The U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement on Trade, or USMCA, included even stronger provisions through its rapid response mechanisms to detect and respond to violations. Both cases show that Congress and the United States government can play an important role in improving and protecting labor rights in the cut flower and other industries around the world. Lastly, I am very concerned that the Trump administration's cuts to the International Labor Affairs Bureau of the Department of Labor, or ILAB, will undermine critical monitoring and enforcement of labor rights protections, including in the U.S.-Colombia Agreement and USMCA. Its proposed elimination would be a major setback from the bipartisan goal of protecting the rights of workers, and I hope to see it restored. So I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses. Again, I think this is a very important topic and one that is worth our reviewing today. And with that, I am happy to yield to the co-chair, who has impeccable timing, co-chair Chris Smith, for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this idea and for this hearing. And I welcome everyone, including our very distinguished panelists. You know, the size of cut flower industry is truly impressive. Written expert testimony refers to 9 billion cut flowers imported annually into the U.S., 85% of which are coming from Colombia and Ecuador. 320,000 jobs in those two countries alone. In the U.S., we spend several $1 billion annually on cut flowers, and we import 36% of all cut flowers globally. There's also a substantial U.S. domestic industry in cut flowers, over 420 substantial businesses engaged in providing U.S. grown and cut flowers. It's a gigantic industry with implications for the lives of a tremendous number of people. Many of them are very vulnerable people working at wage levels or in countries where labor arrangements and under labor arrangements, where they have little ability to defend their own interests. So Congress surely has a responsibility to the people affected by this industry, and again, I want to thank you for calling this hearing. As the chairman of the Africa Subcommittee and the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I'm particularly interested to learn more about the cut flower industry in Africa, where I understand exports to Europe and about any incidents of trafficking in persons and other grave human rights abuses in this industry. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And now let me introduce our witnesses. Allison Gill is the legal director of the Global Labor Justice, an NGO that works transnationally to support workers and unions around the world in exercising their freedom of association. She has conducted field investigations into human and labor rights abuses and developed strategies to protect decent work, strengthen workers' ability to advocate for their rights, and hold corporations accountable. Dr. Daniel Hawkins is the Solidarity Center's Country Program Director for Colombia and the Andean region. He has lived in Colombia for over 20 years, working on human rights and labor rights issues. He has served as a labor rights researcher director of research at the National Union School of Colombia, and as regional coordinator of union building projects across Latin America at the International Transport Workers Federation. Dr. Megan Stiles is an associate professor of environmental studies at the University of Illinois Springfield. She is the author of Roses from Kenya, Labor, Environment, and the Global Trade in Cut Flowers. Since 2004, she has researched labor and environmental issues in the Kenyan cut flower industry. She investigates how farmers and farm workers participate in the production, circulation, and regulation of global commodities. Dr. Christopher Krupa is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. He has been conducting ethnographic research on Ecuador's cut flower industry for over 20 years. His recent book, A Feast of Flowers, Race, Labor, and Post-Colonial Capitalism in Ecuador, won multiple awards. He is currently completing an ethnographic study of Cold War prisons, revolutionary poetics, and state violence in Ecuador. And Christine Bolt is Executive Vice President of AFIA, formerly known as the Association of Floral Importers of America. She's responsible for the implementation of its advocacy and regulatory compliance initiatives with governmental and federal agencies. Prior to joining AFIA, she worked for World Flowers, Inc. In many capacities. And we will begin with Ms. Gill, and just make sure your microphone is on.
Good afternoon, Co-Chair McGovern, Co-Chair Smith, distinguished members of the Commission. It's an honor to testify before you today on the urgent steps needed to protect workers' rights and increase accountability in global cut flower supply chains. I've had an introduction from the co-chair, but I just wanted to note that global labor justice, in addition to supporting workers and unions around the world in exercising their right to freedom of association, we deeply believe and are rooted in the idea that individuals have the right to interact and organize amongst themselves, to collectively express, promote, pursue, and defend their common interests. This includes the right to form trade unions, collectively bargain, and enforce contracts. Global labor justice has a long history promoting labor rights in the global cut flower supply chains. In 2003, the International Labor Rights Forum, one of the organizations that later merged to become Global Labor Justice, launched the Fairness in Flowers campaign in partnership with workers in the cut flower sector and their unions in Colombia and Ecuador. The campaign was among the first to expose abusive working conditions in the industry, including poverty wages, health and safety issues, and gender-based violence and harassment of women workers who make up the majority of the workforce. As you will hear today, these practices persist across cut flower supply chains. Many, if not the vast majority of workers in the cut flower sector, have limited access to their fundamental labor rights, especially freedom of association and collective bargaining. As we will hear, the sector is characterized by a highly gendered workforce. Additionally, it is dependent on vulnerable migrant workers during peak seasons and illegal subcontracting. It's rife with occupational health and safety hazards, including exposure to pesticides and repetitive stress injuries. In some cases, companies fire and blacklist workers for trying to negotiate better wages and working conditions. Local laws in production countries can also undermine associational rights, such as the use of labor pacts in Colombia, which are non-bargained agreements, and labor inspectorates in production countries often lack resources and oversight. Actors at the top of supply chains, including buyers and producer organizations, can contribute to labor exploitation through their purchasing practices, pressure on suppliers, and lack of meaningful due diligence to identify, prevent, and remediate human and labor rights abuses in their supply chains. And as Co-Chair McGovern correctly pointed out, corporate self-regulation in supply chains does not work. Corporate codes of conduct, weak social audit schemes, and multi-stakeholder initiatives, including certification schemes, have been in place for over 20 years, but have not led to material changes for agricultural workers, including in the cut flower sector. As a major importer, the U.S. needs to regulate imports and U.S. buyers to ensure flower imports are produced without labor exploitation. U.S. companies should ensure that purchasing practices cover the cost of production with decent work. Second, due diligence efforts should prioritize engagement with workers and unions and include worker-led systems for identifying and remediating labor violations. These steps are all the more imperative as the threat of increased tariffs could raise costs. And we know from many supply chains that workers will bear a portion of these costs, often in the form of unpaid overtime, higher production targets, wage cuts, and degradation in working conditions. As the top importer of cut flowers, the U.S. can leverage market access to address labor violations and advance decent work in cut flower supply chains. We respectfully make the following recommendations. First, solutions should focus on freedom of association and collective bargaining as enabling rights. Where workers can exercise full freedom of association, they're more likely to have fairer wages, a world of work free of violence and harassment, safe and healthy working conditions, and freedom from forced labor. Freedom of association and collective bargaining also support democracy, resilient supply chains, and fairer trade. These fundamental labor rights are a foundation of responsible business conduct, and their absence is a major risk factor for investors and other supply chain actors. Second, we urge U.S. Congress to ensure that all trade agreements and policies toward flower-producing countries support the introduction and enforcement of international labor standards. Trade agreements are critical to promote freedom of association and labor rights protections. These agreements should be in accordance with ILO conventions, in particular ILO C11, which advances the principle that agricultural workers are entitled to the same freedom of association rights as other workers. Third, trade agreements should include strong trade enforcement mechanisms, and we recommend mechanisms built on the model of the Rapid Response Labor Mechanism under the USMCA, whose facility-specific mechanism has proven highly effective. Fourth, and this is something squarely in Congress's purview, to support supply chain transparency, accountability for supply chain actors, and facilitate effective enforcement of trade remedies, Congress should address the manifest disclosure loophole. Due to their perishable nature, cut flowers are transported primarily by air freight. Yet air and ground carriers, which account for half of all shipments entering the U.S. by value, are exempted from disclosing their manifests. This blind spot impedes supply chain transparency, meaningful due diligence, and targeted supply chain accountability actions and trade enforcement efforts. We also urge Congress to reauthorize the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, of which Ecuador and Kenya, major cut flower producers, were beneficiaries when the program was last in place in 2020. And we urge strengthening of its labor rights conditionality. In reauthorizing GSP, Congress should build upon and improve GSP's strong labor rights conditionality to ensure that GSP meets its development goals of diversifying economically developing countries and growing trade without harming American workers. This includes updating GSP's labor rights framework, aligning labor and environmental standards to modern trade agreements, and including a gender lens, as well as imposing a minimal level of compliance to improve GSP as an accountability tool. And finally, we will join our colleagues from Solidarity Center, whom you'll hear from in a few moments, to urge Congress to recommence discussions with the Colombian government regarding its commitments in the Labor Action Plan, especially related to the continued use of collective pacts and unlawful labor outsourcing in the cut flower sector. Congress should exercise its oversight function to ensure the interagency presses Colombia for full compliance with TPA obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hawkins.
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to address the challenges facing workers in Colombia's cut flower industry. I offer this testimony on behalf of the Solidarity Center. We support workers globally to achieve safe workplaces, fair wages, and the right to organize and bargain collectively. Since 2003, the Solidarity Center has partnered with unions and labor organizations in Colombia to promote freedom of association, collective bargaining, and the rule of law. Much of our work has focused on the Labor Action Plan negotiated under the 2012 US-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement, which identified the cut flower industry as a priority sector due to its widespread labor rights abuses. Colombia's cut flower industry supplies 81% of its exports to the US, generating 200,000 jobs, with over 60% of these workers being women. Despite its economic importance, the industry has been plagued by persistent violations of core labor rights. Workers often face difficult working conditions, long hours, unsafe exposure to agrochemicals, and systemic discrimination against their union activity. Employers commonly use collective pacts, as already mentioned, which are agreements made directly with non-unionized workers to undermine unions and prevent the negotiation of collective bargaining agreements. This is a clear violation of international labor standards. One such example is the National Union for Cut Flower Workers, ONOF, which, despite reforming its statutes to unionize across firms, has been unable to grow beyond 55 members due to employer resistance. Several companies have implemented collective pacts to isolate union members, refusing to negotiate, or failing to implement legally binding CBAs. These practices suppress union activity and deny workers their right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Additionally, some flower firms have adopted deceptive business structures to evade labor obligations. One large flower consortium fragmented its operations into 5 nominally distinct companies. These firms share management, auditors, and even physical locations, yet claim legal separation to avoid government oversight. Interviews with workers confirmed routine transfers between these companies, illustrating the need for inspections to look beyond formal registries to the real nature of labor relations. Seasonal demand spikes, particularly around Valentine's Day and Mother's Day, further constrain labor rights. To meet market pressures, companies hire short-term workers through outsourcing firms to cut costs and reduce benefits. Workers interviewed in 2024 described being transferred across farms, denied seniority bonuses, subjected to layoffs during low seasons, and retaliated against for union activity. The stagnation in unionisation and collective bargaining stands in contrast to improvements in other priority sectors like mining and palm oil. The abrupt and unannounced termination of all Department of Labour ILAB programs in the sector has worsened the situation, cutting off critical support to unions from the Solidarity Centre and other partners. To address these challenges, we respectfully recommend the following actions. 1. Reinvigorate the Labour Action Plan with concrete commitments and robust monitoring mechanisms. The US Trade Representative, State Department, and the Department of Labour should press Colombia for full compliance with TPA labour obligations. 2. Restore and fund ILAB programs in the fiscal year 2026 Labour, Health and Human Services and Education Appropriations Bill. These programs are crucial to building labour capacity and supporting organising efforts. 3. Reinstate State Department and USAID labour rights programs, including the Global Labour Program. These initiatives promote labour rights and democratic governance in Colombia and other countries. 4. Fund protection for Colombian union leaders facing violence and persecution, ensuring their access to justice and safety. And 5, explore the adoption of trade enforcement mechanisms, such as the Rapid Response Labour Mechanism already mentioned by Alison under the USMCA, which has proven effective in enforcing labour rights through facility-specific complaints to US government. In closing, the promises of the US-Colombia Trade Promotion Agreement cannot be fulfilled without decisive US leadership. Congress must act to restore support for programs that strengthen workers' rights, and it must hold both the US and Colombian governments accountable for protecting labour rights. Only through collective action and international cooperation can we achieve lasting improvements for cut flower workers. Thank you for your attention and continued commitment to human rights and global labour.
Well, thank you very much. We'll now turn to Dr. Stiles.
Thank you, Representative McGovern and Representative Smith, for inviting me to testify today. I conducted ethnographic research on labor and environmental issues in the Kenyan cut flower industry between 2004 and 2014. This involved interviews with people working at all levels within the industry, from low-wage workers to farm managers and owners to government agents tasked with designing and enforcing industry regulations. By way of background, Kenya directly supplies about 34% of the cut flowers imported to the European Union and around 8% of those imported to the UK. By contrast, Kenya likely supplies only 1% of the flowers imported to the US. Kenyan growers would ideally like to access US markets, but there are serious logistical and financial barriers to this, including a lack of direct cargo flights and high transport costs. Although few Kenyan flowers circulate in the US, there may be lessons from the Kenyan case study that could be useful for thinking about how to address human rights and environmental concerns in the global cut flower industry more generally. In Kenya, floriculture directly employs around 100,000 people, 65 to 75% of whom are women. Most of these farm workers migrate from other parts of rural Kenya to major sites of Kenyan flower production. They are drawn by the promise of permanent positions with wages and benefits that are low but still higher than those in other Kenyan sectors. Floriculture expanded quickly starting in the late 1990s and is now an important cornerstone of Kenya's export agricultural sector. The industry has long been controversial because of concerns about labor and environmental issues. The principal human rights concerns involve low wages and long working hours, exposure to workplace hazards like agricultural chemicals and extreme heat, sexual harassment and other forms of gender-based violence, procedures for filing complaints and the right to organize, poor living conditions for workers in on-farm worker housing and in off-farm settlements, and broader environmental impacts, including the overuse of scarce water resources, point source pollution coming directly from farms, and non-point source pollution from industry-driven development in rural areas that impact workers and surrounding communities. Since I began researching Kenyan floriculture in 2004, there have been improvements in all but two of these areas: off-farm living conditions and off-farm environmental problems driven by unplanned development in flower-growing areas. Make no mistake, this industry is made possible and profitable by enduringly problematic forms of global inequality, but on-farm working and environmental conditions have gradually improved. These reforms were made possible by a combination of local activism. For instance, the Kenyan Human Rights Commission made the cut flower industry a major target for reform in the early 2000s. Consumer activism in the EU and the UK, including boycotts organized by nonprofit organizations, and to some extent, industrial self-regulation enforced by the major retailers and supermarkets who purchase Kenyan flowers. It is important to note that Kenyan flower growers generally sell their flowers through two routes: direct buy contracts with retailers, especially supermarkets, and the auction system, which generally absorbs higher quality varieties that go out to florists, etc. In general, consumers in the EU and the UK are more concerned than US consumers about ethical trade. Robust activist traditions inspire consumers to think about where products originate and challenge them to hold retailers accountable for labor and environmental conditions within their supply chains. Following struggles to maintain outbreaks of mad cow disease in the 1980s and 1990s, the UK and EU adopted laws that require food products to be traceable and hold actors along supply chains responsible for ensuring safety standards. Although traceability is not legally required for non-food products like flowers, European consumers are more familiar than Americans with labels that certify that products were grown or manufactured according to ethical standards and disclose where these products originate and trace them along the supply chain at every step. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, NGO campaigners in Kenya and the EU focused on rallying consumer support for ethical trade initiatives in the cut flower industry. As a result, most retailers and auction houses in the EU and UK now require Kenyan suppliers to follow specific labor and environmental standards that they enforce through third-party auditing. Major Kenyan flower producers generally participate in one or more labeling schemes that signal their compliance with ethical standards, and they are audited sometimes 3 to 4 times per year by external organizations to ensure compliance. These code-based standards have introduced important, albeit limited, reforms to many Kenyan flower farms, including minimum wage standards, worker housing allowances, standardized working hours, zero tolerance for sexual harassment, maternity leave, personal protective equipment, and access to basic medical care. Based on the example of the Kenyan flower industry, I offer 3 possible policy recommendations. The first is that policies that require or incentivize retailers to sell products with detailed place of origin labels and participate in one or more ethical trade certification programs make it possible for consumers to see where these flowers were grown and advocate for ethical trade. This can be a first step in encouraging consumers to ask questions about labor and environmental conditions in the industry and how their purchase contributes to a local economy or a community of workers in another country. Detailed place of origin labeling, traceability, and certification programs also make it easier to hold retailers accountable for conditions within their supply chains. My understanding is that US law does require imported cut flowers to be marked by country of origin. But because many of these flowers move through a wholesale system rather than going direct to retailers as they do in the commodity chain that connects the Kenya to the EU and the UK, these markings may involve paperwork or bulk container labeling rather than labels that appear on individual bouquets and are legible to consumers. As I noted previously, US retailers may also be extremely hesitant to participate in expensive certification schemes without pressure from consumers or policies that require or incentivize this. While these policies are a start, they still involve trusting consumers to do their research and make informed consumer choices based on product attributes other than price. Retailers must also act voluntarily in response to consumer demand to source products more ethically. When a major flower farm changes hands or fails, these protections for workers and the environment may also evaporate quickly. I witnessed this with the collapse of Sher Karatori, a major Kenyan flower farm in 2014. These caveats inspire my second recommendation. Increasing the capacity or desire of governments and flower producing regions to better regulate floriculture and the natural resources on which it depends can provide a more direct route to improving labor and environmental conditions. This is obviously more difficult to do using the US policy process, but it could be possible to provide rewards in the form of more favorable trade conditions or specific forms of development aid to countries that demonstrate a commitment to an ethical and environmentally responsible flower industry. These kinds of policy actions can be tightly tied to US economic and security interests. For example, the Netherlands, which imports flowers from Kenya that are sold through the famous Dutch auction system, has been centrally involved in restructuring Kenyan water management, partially out of a desire to protect Dutch interests in the cut flower industry, which has been accused of depleting scarce freshwater resources. Lastly, I also encourage you to continue supporting research through competitive grants, etc., investigating human rights issues within the cut flower industry in the context of workers' lives and in the broader political, ecological, and social context. The improvements in working conditions that I describe here have made employment within floriculture more bearable for Kenyan workers. However, the social and environmental effects of this industry are complex. Research on flower farming can help identify additional points of leverage for reform and empower changes that will be the most meaningful from the standpoint of people working in and living directly with the effects of this industry. Thank you again for the opportunity to share these recommendations. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Dr. Krupa.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank the co-chairs, Representative McGovern and Representative Smith, and all members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for the invitation to participate in today's hearing. It is truly an honor to be here. As Representative McGovern mentioned, I'm an anthropologist at the University of Toronto. I've been conducting ethnographic research in Highland, Ecuador since the mid-1990s and on its cut flower sector from the business side and among workers in neighboring communities for about 25 years. For the purposes of today's hearing, as you know, there's about 25% of US roses come from Ecuador, and just under half of all flower exports from Ecuador end up in the US. So I want to draw attention to just two major areas of concern for labor rights protection in Ecuador's cut flower industry. First, I think it's imperative to situate export flower growing in the larger human rights crisis currently engulfing Ecuador right now. This crisis stems, on the one hand, from the indiscriminate violence being committed by the recent surge of narco-trafficking groups and criminal gangs operating in the country, which has given Ecuador the highest homicide rate by far in mainland Latin America, and on the other, from the internal armed conflict that President Noboa has launched against these groups. Revolving state of exception decrees have given impunity and omnipotence to security forces and made extrajudicial execution, torture, and forced disappearance by its military and police commonplace, and have affected an expanding CCOT-style prison system brutally controlled by the military. Now, this has many significant impacts on the flower sector. People fleeing the violence on the coast are increasingly seeking refuge and work in the highland plantation zones, while families who live around the highland plantations are becoming stuck there, unable to continue their circular migration patterns and becoming, for the first time, totally dependent on plantation labor. We're seeing hypersaturated labor markets, increased precarity of worker communities, and new potential for security conflicts and human rights abuses within plantation labor systems, including by the private security companies hired to police the plantations. So I think the starting point for thinking about policy interventions into this commodities production and trade has to be a consideration of what labor rights even mean in an export industry operating essentially under warlike conditions. The second thing I want to note is a major change in the ways cut flower production is happening in Ecuador today, giving rise to something of a paradox in how labor rights can be protected or potentially violated. On the one hand, Ecuadorian flower growers, who are mainly domestic elites or long-term expats and not large foreign companies, hold strong nationalist sentiments that frame the expansion of flower plantations into rural and indigenous territories as akin to a development or even humanitarian project, bringing progress and uplift to desperately poor and racially marginalized rural people. Labor is the centerpiece to this ideology, and flower growers have long prided themselves on respecting and even exceeding national labor laws, social security requirements, and have ostentatiously shown interest in the well-being of their workforce, signing on to virtually any international monitoring program to come along, especially if it offers a certificate. Ecuador also has a famously progressive labor code with specific articles outlawing all manifestations of child and forced labor, ratified by constitutional guarantees of this, and a resilient social security system that is not afraid to seize the lands of non-compliant businesses, and has signed on to numerous international conventions against specific offenses like child and forced labor. And yet, on the other hand, we see endless campaigns and programs created to eliminate egregious labor rights abuses, especially in the cut flower sector, including, for instance, the $4.7 million grant recently awarded by the U.S. Department of Labor through the Bureau of International Labor Affairs for the Agro Justo program to eradicate child labor in the cut flower and banana sectors. So where are violations slipping through this otherwise seemingly tight safety net? So the best answer, I think, is a trend toward restructuring in the industry to contract out a lot of the essential work needed to run plantations and to complete the kinds of orders that plantations now rely on, especially the prepackaged bouquets sold in supermarkets. Main flowers are still largely grown on plantations using an intensive production model, with workers' rights often well protected by law and celebrated by their owners, but with a number of violations, specific violations to the concrete labor practices, which I could get into, but an increasing number of flowers sold by larger companies, often rounding out their bouquets, are now being grown on very small farms of a half hectare or even less, often on the lands of ex-flower workers who have turned their subsistence plots over to flowers, shifting their cultivation from potatoes or domestic consumption or local markets to now growing flowers that they sell to neighboring plantations, either informally or under contract, and adapting family or traditional or domestic labor practices to this new export product. Or these small providers may be completely unknown to the larger farm who buys the product irregularly and whose means of accessing land and labor are potentially quite sketchy. Either way, the potential for sanctionable labor rights violations seems to rest most heavily on this increasingly dense interface between the flower companies themselves and the other economic systems being folded into the global export trade. So 2 recommendations. First, labor rights need to be monitored and assessed in the full matrix of human rights threats affecting working communities. Local human rights groups and legal teams need to be supported in their ability to evaluate and respond to the complex intersections arising between labor rights and human rights, especially in contexts of critical insecurity and mass violence. Second, local supply chain accountability and place of origin traceability need to be able to track and monitor all inputs into the commodity being sold, which in Ecuador's cut flower industry is not just single bunches of roses or carnations or sunflowers, but also bouquets and other products that have complex forms of informal micro-industrial consolidation that extend well beyond the central plantations. Thank you.
Thank you, and Ms. Bolt.
Good afternoon, Co-Chair McGovern and Co-Chair Smith. Thank you for allowing me to be here today to speak on behalf of the cut flower industry. The United States cut flower importing industry has come a long way since the 1960s, when a United States professor went to Colombia and determined that growing carnations there could be a big opportunity, and it was close to the U.S. for shipping. Being close to the Ecuador gives Colombia and other countries the advantage of having the same temperature all year long and provide ability to commercially grow flowers all year. Not only did Colombia have good growing weather, but it also had available land and labor to work the farms. Jobs on flower farms were legitimate jobs and opportunities for many, including women, who did not have employment opportunities, especially in rural areas. A majority of these women are also heads of households, so providing the ability for them to support their families. Currently, about 85% of the flowers that are imported into the United States come from 2 importing trading partners, Colombia and Ecuador. In total, we import more than 9 billion stems from countries all over the world. Colombia has about 10,500 hectares of production. Ecuador has over 5,000. Worldwide, there are other high-producing importing growing regions such as the Netherlands, Kenya, and Ethiopia. The Netherlands has been providing flowers to much of Europe, and some come to the U.S. African countries such as Kenya and Ethiopia provide most of their production to Europe, with a small amount coming to the U.S. The importing cut flower industry does not feel that we compete with the flowers that are grown in the U.S., but complement them. In the U.S., they grow specialty and novelty products that get put together with the flowers that are imported. California is the largest growing state in the U.S., and over the past 10 years, many of these U.S. growers have expanded their operations into Mexico due to land, labor, and water issues that they face growing in the U.S. These flowers are then trucked across the border and combined with the U.S. flowers. Over the years, the cut flower industry has grown significantly and currently supporting about 200,000 formal jobs in Colombia, of which 110,000 are direct positions. In Ecuador, about 120,000 jobs, of which half are direct jobs. Kenya has about 200,000 people directly employed in the floriculture sector, and Ethiopia has about 200,000 direct and indirect jobs. In order to support these jobs, most of the farms provide a lot for their employees, such as above minimum wages, Social Security, doctors and dentists who come to the farms, on-site daycare, transportation, education, etc. Associations such as Socoflores in Colombia provide training to HR managers and company leaders regarding IOLL standards and provide guides for good practices in labor relations. Growing in countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, and Kenya that are close to the equator can provide more than sustainably grown flowers year-round and provide business opportunities for these countries. Reviewing sustainable products is not just about the transportation, but it's about the entire growing cycle of the flowers. Over the years, there have been many sustainable labels that have been created to help provide guidance for farms, for things such as environmental, labor, and social issues. In Colombia, Flor Verde was started more than 25 years ago for farms to do the right thing, before sustainability was even a topic, and is now available as a third-party label to any farm worldwide. It is overseen by third-party certification bodies. Flor Ecuador was started more than 10 years ago to provide guidance for farms in Ecuador. Worldwide, there are several schemes, such as Global Gap and others. Because there were so many different labels available and a push for customers to be more sustainable, many of the groups came together to provide industry worldwide information to all involved in one place, which started the Floriculture Sustainability Initiative. One thing that many in the industry knew was that it would be too hard to come up with one label that would fit all countries and all circumstances. So FSI provides a guide for not only the farms, but the customers with information to make good business decisions. In today's environment, with major customers, supermarkets and mass markets, they are very focused on making sure that their suppliers are not only saying that they're doing the right thing, but they're doing the right thing. They come to the farms to check the processes to make sure they are doing the right thing. Many flower farms are so large and produce flowers for their major customers are not going to risk their commercial business so they can be a part of so they are part of more than one certification and comply with the requirements. All flowers that are imported into the United States must be marked with the country of origin. All boxes that arrive have to be marked, and for bouquets that are going to be sold in supermarkets or mass markets, the country of origin is required to be on the sleeve or label so that the ultimate purchaser is informed of where the flowers are grown. This is overseen by Customs and Border Protection regulations. There are so many other things that we could talk about, but time is limited, so I would be happy to answer questions that you might have about this important topic.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank the entire panel for your testimony. Before I get to questions, I'm going to yield to Co-Chair Smith, and he will begin.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thanks for that courtesy. I do have a meeting. I have to be at 3 o'clock, so I apologize. Excellent testimony. I love the way that you lay out the issues and then have your recommendations. I think it just lays it out for us so we can better act on it, so thank you for that. I do have a couple of questions. Allison, Ms. Gill, you talked about the pesticides, and my First Amendment in the U.S. House of Representatives was on herbicide Agent Orange and the devastating impact it had on Vietnamese and our men and women in Vietnam. Pesticides are killers. In that case, it was an effort to defoliate, of course, but it still had a very, very toxic chemical in it. How bad is the pesticide issue? I mean, even when I do my own lawn, I put down a granule that is absolutely safe for animals and people because of what pesticides do in our water system. But if you've got cut flowers coming in, being sold everywhere, and especially the people that are doing it and have, they're inhaling and touching and everything else, how big of a problem are the pesticides with regards to cut flowers? How is that being monitored?
Thanks so much for that question, Congressman. I'm going to kick us off, and then I'll defer also to the country level experts who probably know the specific country level situations in more granular detail than I do. But certainly, for example, in Colombia, we know that many cut flower workers are not employed formally, or they might be employed seasonally or through some kind of labor recruiter, and not necessarily given PPE. So they may be working, without gloves, without masks. They're often working in greenhouses with high humidity, which sort of opens the pores and allows for greater absorption of pesticides. And so when we have worked with unions, including now, they report, high levels of exposure and some, ill effects of these. I would also note that in Colombia, where workers are disproportionately women, and some come seasonally for these peak seasons around Mother's Day and Valentine's Day in particular, some of them also bring their children with them to greenhouses and to plantations, and so they may have children nearby who also then would face some exposure risk. But I really do want to let the colleagues who know the specific country situations a chance to respond.
You want to yield to Mr. Hawkins or Mr. Krupa? Want to add to this?
Thank you very much, Congressman, Congresswoman. Yeah, I think basically, obviously, it depends on the specific firm. You have one of the problems with the use and exposure to agrochemicals or pesticides is the nature of the actual job workers are doing. That really determines the level of exposure they may have, and also the hours they need to work. So in peak season, Mother's Day, Valentine's Day, you're getting workers that are having to do overtime continuously, and obviously that's going to expose them more. Generally, the certification systems they're a little bit more stringent in terms of complying with environmental standards and the use and storage of agrochemicals than they are with specifically ensuring freedom of association and other labor standards. However, there have been issues mentioned by workers that we have supported and their unions in terms of affectations from agrochemicals, the lack of, what would you say, focused doctors looking at the association between work and agrochemical exposure, determining illnesses and sickness of these workers. I think that's something that needs to be improved. In the Colombian case, there has been an improvement in terms of the labor inspection system to monitor and make sure firms have better compliance with this topic, but there still is room for improvement. Thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly, because I do have to go, and I apologize for that. Professor Krupka, you talked about the extremely progressive labor code in Ecuador, outlawing all manifestations of child enforced labor, ratified by constitutional guarantees, and a resilient social security system. I'm not sure what that means, but maybe you can explain it. But yet there's a huge problem still, and I'm wondering, is it a lack of enforcement personnel? They don't have the ability to do it, or the political will is lacking? And secondly, real quick, I get a sense that there's a disagreement among the panel about labeling, and I'm just wondering, Professor Krupka, you and others talked about, a place of origin, traceability, and the like, and Ms. Bolte, you talked about that it is there. I just wondered how that is reconciled. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question, Representative Smith. Yes, so what's the paradox then? Strong labor laws, and yet evidence of a labor rights violation. So how do we explain that? And yes, I think that I would repeat sort of the structure that I laid out, that that increasingly a number of central production is being sort of subcontracted and outsourced to areas beyond just the formal plantation. And so there's a divide between the sites that are inspected and the sites that are sort of off the radar. And so it seems to me that the programs that are rising up are really addressing this kind of interface between the formal plantation zone and the kind of outside world that's being increasingly brought into the plantations. And so I would say that that's a real topic of concern right now in the way that the Ecuadorian cut flower industry is going. It's there's incredible cost benefits for them to do this, and so this is one of the ways in which they're meeting their efficiency mandate. The other thing is that, yes, I've heard reports from workers' associations that there's a strong sense that oftentimes the legal representatives in the city that they would turn to have business interests in the flower sector, or they're in cahoots with the private security company that contracts for the plantation, and don't feel that their ability to sort of press for restitution of their labor rights violation is taken seriously. And yet at this formal level, there are very strong laws and guarantees against this. So it's these gaps between the sort of progressive vision and the ability to execute, and where that's structurally laid out in the production line is what I'm thinking is the most important thing.
Okay, and I'll address the cut flower marking. So I did provide to the Commission the CBP, or Customs and Border Protection regulations, that have been in place for many, many years. Every single box that crosses the border of the United States has to have the marking of the country of origin, and the bouquets that end up in a supermarket or mass market are required by Customs and Border Protection to have the label of where the product comes from. I challenge anyone to go into a supermarket today, whether it's on the sleeve itself or whether it's on the label, it will say product of Colombia, or product of Ecuador, or product of Kenya. It is required by law. If we bring the stuff into the United States, the Customs and Border Protection will not allow, they will refuse the products to come into the United States if they are not marked. Now, there is a difference if the products are coming from Mexico and trucked in a bucket into California and then put into bouquets in California that end up in a supermarket. But those bouquets also have to be labeled manufactured or produced in whatever the major country is that the product is coming from. All of that is in the regulations that I provided. Yes.
Thank you. Its own.
I would like
Okay,
to jump in about
Sure.
you mentioned that there's the disagreement among the panelists about the impact of the ethical trade certification programs and the inspections. Is it okay to talk
Yeah,
about that
Dr.
now?
Stiles, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and so I noted that too, and I certainly don't want to say that this kind of voluntary self-regulation is enough for these industries, but I think maybe some of what is coming out of my statement that is different from what's coming out of the other context is just that, that these commodity chains that connect Kenya and the UK and Europe are kind of differently structured from those that connect Colombia and Ecuador to the United States. And so again, a lot of these Kenyan flowers are going to these directly to these supermarkets, and it's the retailers themselves that are making decisions about which labeling programs to participate in or whether to develop their own labeling program. And so there's sort of a different level of retailer responsibility versus that importation issue. And I am grateful for the corrections and to my understanding about these place of origin labelings in the US, because it's not necessarily my speciality. But I think that, thinking there's a difference between just place of origin labeling and then how many people are actually producers are participating in these labeling schemes, and the degree to which retailers are requiring that, or the government could require that in some way. And then many of the folks that spoke today talked about this really incredible history of labor movement activism in Colombia and Ecuador. And to me, that's very different in Kenya. So I didn't focus that much on that. In Kenya, the flower farm workers sometimes view the labor unions as problematically corrupt or sort of entangled within ethnic politics, and depending on whether it's an election year and sort of how ethnic politics are playing out, it can be difficult for people to see those resources as useful to them. And there was also an original Kenyan Agriculture and Workers Plantation Union that represented all agricultural industries in Kenya, but there was a long-running movement to form one that was more specific to the horticulture and floriculture industry. That union has been formed, but just sort of the powers of those unions and workers' trust in those institutions is really just as sort of background for understanding where some of our statements might have been really different.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a few questions. Ms. Gill, both you and Dr. Hawkins alluded to the rapid response labor mechanism under the USMCA as an effective best practice for enforcing labor rights that could serve as a model for other trade agreements. Can you explain what this mechanism does and what its impact has been, and what challenges
So the dispute expedited enforcement of workers' free association and collective bargaining rights at the facility level. So, other kinds of enforcement mechanisms might be at the national level or the international level if you want to bring a complaint to the ILO. But this allows workers in a dispute at their workplace to bring a complaint, in the framework of the trade agreement. A country can submit a request for review to another country to determine whether there is a denial of rights, attempt to remediate anything it finds. And the panel can assess complaints about conditions at specific facilities. Where there's non-compliance, it can provide for the suspension of tariff benefits under the USMCA or impose other penalties like denial of entry of goods. In terms of, I think there would be, to be honest, I think there would be a number of challenges if we're talking about imposing a facility-specific mechanism in cut flowers, but they're not insurmountable. We really do think this is a useful mechanism and should be part of trade agreements. There was a little bit of conversation before about traceability. Country of origin information is pretty limited. Just tells you one piece of information. I think you probably know well, Congressman, from your work on the UFLPA, how important traceability is to real trade enforcement.
Right.
In the cotton supply chains emanating from the Uyghur region, businesses really have to know down to sort of the very specific farm level, oftentimes now, where their cotton is grown, so that they can ensure that they're in compliance with UFLPA and other laws. With flowers, we don't have that level. You don't know who the producer is. You don't know the farm or what producer association they belong to. And from our side, advocates can't know who the importer is,
right,
or anything about the producers, in part because of the manifest disclosure problem. They're coming in by air, so they're not disclosed in sort of the regular kind of databases. So we would want to see some of those things addressed so that you could have a facility level mechanism, but by all means, I would encourage that to be part of the trade discussion with Colombia.
No, I appreciate that. You recommended that U.S. companies should improve their due diligence by establishing worker-led systems for identifying and remediating labor violations. Can you explain what such a system would look like in practice and give any examples that you've seen of a system like this that has been effective in other places?
Sure. And, due diligence is sort of the flip side of enforcement. It's the way for companies to prevent human rights problems in their supply chains and to address them if they find them, whereas an enforcement action only catches you once there's a problem. So I think these two systems need to work hand in hand. When I talk about due diligence, what I really want companies to do is not establish their own worker-led mechanisms, but work with worker organizations like unions. Unions and workers are the best sources of information about the workplace, not third-party assessors who might come in for a day on some kind of announced inspection, but workers and unions who are on the job. There are really innovative and important supply chain models that work. These are models that tie collective bargaining or bargained agreements at the bottom of the supply chain to the buying power at the top of the supply chain. We have a couple of these agreements in the garment sector, one in India and a recent one that we signed in Indonesia. And these are models where we leverage market access, so the buyers at the top will commit to encouraging these practices by buying from suppliers that have bargained agreements with their workers. So that, to me, is sort of the gold standard for due diligence.
Well, thanks. That's helpful. Dr. Hawkins, Can you elaborate on some of the ways in which iLab has played an important role in promoting labor rights in Colombia, and what the stakes are if its funding is not restored?
Certainly can, Chairman. Thank you very much. Well, for the cut flower industry and workers in the cut flower industry, I think it's been absolutely imperative. Despite all the challenges, I think the iLab funded projects have really enhanced the pressure from workers to the labour authorities to ensure that the mechanisms included in the TPA, but also the Labour Action Plan, were actually complied with, or there was more action, there was more labour regulation, there was more processing of labour complaints, there was more collaboration between the US government, Dole, and also the Labour Ministry in terms of complying with these concrete mechanisms trying to protect core labour rights. It was also a capacity-focused program, especially the projects that we've operated from the Solidarity Centre. That's not just looking at the regulatory sphere, but also trying to ensure that workers can understand their labour rights and can advocate effectively for the protection of their labour rights, and also to understand, so how do you form a union? What do you need to do to register a union? How do you go about collectively bargaining? What are the compliance mechanisms that an employer has to do so? And if there is violation in terms of the unlawful use of collective pacts, for example, how do we go about trying to ameliorate that, or to ensure that labour inspectors come and they understand what is happening? So you could say that the improvement has been difficult, slight, and often it's gone back and forth. However, the projects have really ensured that workers have a voice, which is the most effective mechanism to ensure that labour rights are actually adhered to, because we can't expect, especially in this ever competitive global system, that it's just going to be labour inspection systems and labour authorities that are going to protect all the fundamental labour rights that workers have. Workers need to do that themselves, but they can only do that through their collective voice, and this is only through, at this state in time, strong, independent and autonomous unions. And I think also linking back to the question about the rapid response mechanism in the USMCA agreement between Canada, Mexico and the US, that was also linked to the labour reform of 2019 in Mexico, which modernized the labour relations system and gave workers the possibility to affiliate to an independent and autonomous union, and then to advocate through this mechanism to protect against systemic labour rights violations in different firms. So I think it's got to be about worker voice, and that's one of the key things that the iLab funded projects did. And now workers have been completely left by themselves. You know, we're in the middle of processes to train them, to develop their capacity to actually ensure that they could effectively practice their freedom of association rights. And now they're kind of back to square one. So it's very unfortunate.
Let me just stay with you for a second. Dr. Krupa mentioned the impact that the context of violence and organized crime has had on the ability of workers in Ecuador's cut flower producing regions to organize and access meaningful protections. Colombia, as we all know, has also dealt with its share of violence and organized crime. Can you talk a little bit about how this has affected Colombian workers and their access to labor rights? Has it improved any in the wake of the 2016 peace agreement? And are there any useful lessons that can be drawn from Colombia's experience for other countries experiencing violence and organized crime?
It's an excellent question, Chairman. Yes, I think we could see there's a huge spike at the moment in Ecuador in the most recent years, as my colleague Professor Krupa mentioned. In Colombia, what did occur through the Labour Action Plan and let's say, the pressure that put on the Colombian government to make advances in terms of protecting unionists who were facing death threats, were facing other kind of human rights violations, and also improve the system to actually bring the culprits of the homicides to justice. I think one of them, for example, through the Labour Action Plan, was the development of the National Unit of Protection, which has had a lot of problems in terms of its implementation. However, it is a concrete institutional mechanism that unionists, other land advocates and activists and social activists in the country can request when they receive death threats, when they receive harassment, etc., for the actual human rights defense activities that they do. In the Colombian cut flower industry, it's maybe a little bit different from the other priority sectors of the Labour Action Plan, in that 90% of production is located around the two main cities of Colombia, Bogota and Medellin. So you don't have such exposure to conflict, political, social conflict in the rural areas of the country, which has decimated many, many unions across the banana sector, across ports, across palm oil production and mining, etc., over the years, as well as obviously teachers, hospital workers, etc. Cut flowers, as they're on the kind of rural-urban border, quite close to Bogota, the main production center, they haven't had such impacts from violence. However, I think Colombia has shown that there is possibility to make advances, and they need to have this monitoring mechanism, which has fallen by the wayside, unfortunately, in the Colombian case in recent years, to be able to protect unionists, workers, social activists, land rights activists against these violent sprees. I think just after the signing of the peace agreements in 2006, there was a couple of years where you had a reduction in violence against unionists and union leaders. We have had a spike in the last couple of years, not to the levels previously around the early to late 2000s and 2010s. However, there's still a lot of improvement to be made, and what would you say, kind of shoring up the institutional mechanisms that exist, but need to have governmental and political will to continue their implementation.
Let me just ask you a question about the role USAID and the State Department have played in promoting human rights and fair labor practices in Colombia and elsewhere. I mean, maybe I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth here, but I think they have played an important role in advancing these things. And I'd like your assessment about the impact of the reorganization of the State Department, the cutting of USAID, and the elimination of the Global Labor Program on the protection of worker rights around the world. I'm very concerned about that. I'm just wondering whether you feel the same way.
We definitely do, Chairman. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, because I think what these programs offer is the possibility to develop processes that are focused on harnessing and empowering worker voice and protecting core labor rights. So just, for example, in Colombia, through the Global Labor Program, we worked specifically on building worker power and collective worker voice with palm oil workers, with port workers. These are two sectors from the 5 priority sectors of the Labour Action Plan, as well as many other workers, public sector workers for collective bargaining processes in the public sector, which prior to 2014 in Colombia was not possible. So it's a real advocacy initiative that protects often the most vulnerable workers, but working for them and through them for many years to develop their own capacity to do their own protection initiatives, to represent their members as they should, to advocate for specific labor or policy and also labor legislation, which can more effectively protect workers' rights. So I think just like the unilateral termination of the iLab projects, the other terminations of the labor-focused USAID projects have also completely disempowered worker organizations that had begun to effectively advocate for their members and even develop a worker voice which previously they didn't have or did not exist in specific sectors.
Thank you. Dr. Stiles, in your testimony, you said that consumers in Europe are more concerned about ethical trade than those in the United States, and that regulations and consumer pressure there have led to stronger enforcement of Kenyan compliance with labor and environmental standards. Are there policies in Europe that have made a positive impact on human rights and labor practices along the supply chain that could the United States that the United States could learn from and incorporate into our own proposals?
This is an excellent question, and I'm not sure I can answer today in enough detail, but I can certainly work on incorporating that into my final written statement. So I think a lot of this that has motivated it in the EU and the UK result from those laws that were passed following the outbreak of mad cow disease in the 1980s and 1990s that were focused on food and the issue of traceability along those supply chains, and that there aren't necessarily laws that require it for things like cut flowers, but because retailers are doing that for other products that they're importing, that practice is translating into other areas where it's not necessarily required by law yet. That is my first answer on that, and I need to do a little bit more research to understand it in a better way. But the emphasis in the laws that do exist for food that stem from those food safety concerns are really focused on that idea of the product being traced, as was said before, not just to country of origin, but to the individual farm, and then placing the responsibility on actors along that supply chain to ensure that they're documenting that appropriately and that they're ensuring that proper safety standards are being followed. And then that has sort of spilled over into these concerns about ethical standards in terms of labor conditions and broader environmental practices on those farms.
Thank you very much. Can you explain to me how the auction system in the Netherlands works? I mean, how does it facilitate the Dutch government's efforts that you mentioned to put pressure on producing countries like Kenya for system reforms that reflect better environmental or labor standards? And are there any implications that the U.S. can learn from this model or reforms that could be made to our importing system?
Sure, thank you for that question. So in a way, it's not the Dutch auction system itself that's inspiring the Netherlands to do that. I think in this case, using that example of the Netherlands wanting to be centrally involved in restructuring Kenyan water law, that is because a number of the farms are either owned or there are investors or there have been in the past who were Dutch. So there's sort of Dutch capital wrapped up in the flower industry in Kenya, and also just in previous development efforts and investment efforts in terms of the Dutch government's focus on development in Africa. They've chosen water as one of the focus of their efforts. So because there is Dutch money and investment and potential in the Kenyan flower industry, that's what makes them interested in this. And they sort of chose water as one of the major things that they would try to regulate because there were problems with the availability of water and then the cleanliness of that water to be continued to be used to grow flowers. So that's sort of the partially the Dutch interest in there that, you know, the Netherlands was very centrally involved in the production of flowers, but rising labor and environmental regulatory costs have sort of pushed that industry abroad, as has the growth of the desire for these products and wanting to be able to grow them in equatorial climates where you can produce them year-round with lower power costs. So, and in terms of just how the Dutch auction system works, so the Kenyan flowers that come to that, they grow kind of better varieties that are more complex to grow, and then because they can usually get a higher price for them on the Dutch auction system. Although some of the Kenyan flower growers have created their own sort of online auction systems that work throughout Europe that also bypass that original Dutch auction system at Alsmeer, but use sort of the same structure to sell those products.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Krupa, you described a context of serious violence and organized crime, and the government of Ecuador's militarized state of exception that has led to serious human rights violations. How should U.S. military assistance to countries like Ecuador take into account its impact on the rights of workers and the production system and industries like cut flowers?
Thank you for that question, Representative McGovern. I would love to think with you on that. I don't know actually how at the regulatory level those two should be tied together. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because this is looking at it from the point of view of these sort of intensely concentrated sites where production of flowers occurs in Ecuador, and noting that they're becoming hotbeds of receiving labor migrants, many migrants fleeing violence, and also possibly bringing with them links to the kinds of activity that they're fleeing, entering into situations where security companies themselves have links to both sides of the conflict, and where incredible amounts of foreign funding, including from the United States, is going into expanding a military system that is being granted sort of indiscriminate power and committing grievous human rights abuses. So I'm very concerned about, and I loved your question as well to Daniel about this, of learning from the Colombian case and thinking about, especially in workers' efforts to organize, to unionize, to form the associations independent of individual farms, and how this sort of use of arbitrary violence to sort of settle all kinds of disputes will spill over into the inability of workers to sort of press for collective bargaining, as well as routine things like violations of unpaid overtime or these kinds of things.
No. And I think we should do some follow-up too, because I'm this is for me some information gathering, and I'm trying to figure out like potential avenues that we could pursue here in Congress. So I appreciate your response.
Thank you.
Let me ask you another question. I understand that many of the flower-producing regions in Ecuador are in territories with a significant indigenous population. And, what has been the impact of the flower industry in this region of Ecuador on collective rights of indigenous people? What role have civil society groups in Ecuador, including labor and indigenous movements, played in advocating for improvements in conditions in the flower-producing regions? And are there any insights that civil society and other flower-producing countries can learn from these campaigns?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. Historically, the indigenous, so yes, it's absolutely true that the flower growing in Ecuador started on the outskirts of densely concentrated indigenous territories and expanded into them, drew the bulk of its labor force from indigenous communities, and maintains very close relations with highly concentrated flower growing areas are surrounded by indigenous communities. So the relations are very tight. So there's so much that could be said about this. The strong indigenous movements have historically had their greatest successes in pressing for state reforms that then ask the various levels of the state to intervene on their behalf in sort of securing water rights that are threatened by expanding flower farms, or those kinds of things. And so there's been very little action that I know of that has been at least successful in indigenous communities directly addressing flower plantations. And so the route has been through various organizations of state to then monitor. On the other hand, flower companies themselves have done a lot to undermine the internal organization of indigenous communities in numerous ways that I could document, but that wasn't exactly your question. I think the historic strengths of the indigenous movement with respect to the impact of the flower industry have been to draw from members from flower growing regions to then press for strong recommendations of state intervention into flower producers.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question. How should we reconcile the prohibitions on forced labor, on forced and child labor that are so central to protecting labor rights in the cut flower industry with the reality of small family farms where all members of a family might be involved in planting or harvesting, on a hectare of land? What challenges does Ecuador face in implementing meaningful protections and oversight of flower production while considering the social structure of the communities where flowers are produced?
Right. Another excellent question, and thank you for that. So the larger point that I was wanting to make with that example was that historically, since at least 2000, flower growers, I think, have been very vocal about their endorsement of a very strong model of labor protection, while also finding very subtle ways to sort of work around it. And so I think that a lot of the very kind of showy sort of certificates and policy prescriptions they've been very supportive of, but again, have sort of found alternatives to that. And so things like that both Daniel and Allison mentioned, like labor outsourcing and the fragmentation of companies, these were huge things in like 20 years ago, and these have both been outlawed within the current labor code in Ecuador. So growers complain that they can't do this anymore, forming their own third-party labor contractor to then hire back their workers under, more contracts more favorable to them. These used to be rampant as one of those sort of search for sort of informal mechanisms to undermine their own respect of strong labor laws. Now the thing is this, like I've said, this sort of contracting of routine operations, including the growing of flowers, to locations off farm. And so this is, and this occurs beyond just that. So even things like turning over a greenhouse from the production of one type of flower to another, or disposing of massive amounts of plastic tarps, or digging irrigation trenches for a new greenhouse being put in, are generally subcontracted to a labor contractor who's given a certain amount of money, and it's up to them to then bring along as many people as they want and pay them whatever they want. And so this is where you'll find incidents of, the very old, the very young, showing up on a kind of informal labor contract. And then now this expansion of technically a kind of expansion of the farm beyond the farm to these smaller farms that are being contracted to grow either specialized flowers that are being requested by their buyers. If a plantation runs out of them, a grower I know says he gets like 10 emails a day from just unsolicited emails from people writing and saying, do you need more of this flower? And has no idea who they are. And sometimes he has to accept and buy them from them. So many of these providers are, as I said, ex-flower workers who've seen an opportunity, and instead of growing potatoes for subsistence or onions for a local market where they're getting very poor returns, have set up a small half-hectare of flower growing and then have used the same labor practices. So does this violate child labor laws? Right, is, I think, the question. And flower growers, I think, are quite proud of this and would fold this into their vision of how the expansion of the export industry has improved local living conditions. No longer are people getting, 3 cents for an onion, but they're getting 14 cents or whatever for one of these flowers, or more if they need them urgently. And so flower growers tend to fold this into their sort of idea of how they're improving local livelihoods, while they are generally exempt from any sort of labor oversight, not paying into Social Security, And the land is probably still listed as subsistence farming land and not even sort of commercial farming land. So yes, it would technically violate all of that. And so again, my recommendation is to sort of think about the ways in which the sort of central sites of production that have been usually the targets of our certification and monitoring insight are actually only one node in a larger production network that farms rely on. And it's not just a sort of temporary thing, but it's a routine part of running these businesses. And those would need to be part of the product tracing, and they'd need to be made a part of the evaluation of labor standards.
Thank you. I have some questions for Ms. Bolt. And let me just kind of explain to everybody kind of where we are, because I want you to know there's a light at the end of the tunnel, okay? So I have some questions for Ms. Bolt, and then I just have a couple of questions I'm going to throw out there. Any or all can answer, and then I'll give everybody kind of a minute to say whatever you think needs to be said that hasn't been raised or said. So if that's okay with everybody, so Ms. Bolt, you indicated that marking requirements and labeling initiatives accompanied by inspections provide farms and customers with information to make good business decisions, in other words, to increase transparency, right? Would you agree that transparency would also be improved by closing the manifest disclosure loophole to extend requirements to disclose information about cross-border shipments to air freight, which account for most cut flower imports, and what would be the impact of this action for the flower importers and customers?
Thank you for the question. That was one of the things I wanted to try to address, because I guess as an importer and an association that represents the importers, I don't see any loopholes. Mm-hmm. Back when Obama was president, he put out one window at the border, which was a huge opportunity for all government agencies to come together and have one set of data that is provided to all government agencies of the information that's provided at the border. So in today's environment, if a cut flower shipment comes to Miami, which is where most of it comes from, you have to provide not only the manifest, but you have to provide packing lists and all information, and every entry is put in by the number of stems. So absolutely down transparency is absolutely important, and it is provided. Okay. So all entities that are imported into the United States come through some Center for Excellence and Expertise, which is a CBP entity. That Center for Excellence and Expertise is the one who provides all the information. Anyone from the government could go to customs and they could ask, where is the information, or what is the stems that come in to the country? Where did it come from? All the way down to the packing list. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't maybe some consolidation sites that potentially, maybe to one of my panelists' comments, maybe there are some small family farms that provide to a consolidated grower, but that information is available. Also, any shipments that leave Colombia or Ecuador are, by law, they have to provide the information to the government of exactly what's being shipped. So from every farm, the government of Colombia and Ecuador absolutely knows exactly what's being shipped. But I think the main thing is there is transparency in that, and I would love to speak more to people about what that is.
Well, maybe Ms. Gill can explain exactly what is the manifest disclosure loophole, so we know where we're.
I don't disagree with you that information is collected by customs, but it is not publicly disclosed. So there has been an interpretation of the Tariff Act that it requires the disclosure, the public disclosure of ocean manifest information, but not of rail, road, or air freight information. So if I go into Import Genius or Panjiva, I can only see cut flowers coming in from Colombia by ocean, which is a small percent.
So fortunately or unfortunately, there are a lot more flowers that are coming in by ocean now. But the government has a protection mechanism in place that I can't even get information about who actually is shipping I can get information on a weekly basis. I get information from the government of how many stems come across the border, what countries they come from. But past that, the government has a protection where they don't allow information about exactly who's the importer of record or where they're getting their product from.
Then we agree on the problem.
Okay. So, Ms. Bolt, one other question. You talked about the marking requirements that ensure cut flowers are marked with the country of origin if they're to be sold in supermarkets or mass markets. Since presumably this would exclude flowers sold directly to florists and designers or for events, can you clarify roughly what proportion of imports are sold to supermarkets or mass markets and thus are subject to this rule? And is there a potential need to increase traceability and transparency about place of origin for these kind of exempt flower sales?
Okay, so approximately 60 to 65% of the stems that come across the border go into supermarkets and mass markets. We don't have a true collection mechanism because in our industry everything's private. So we estimate 60 to 65% of the stems go to supermarkets and mass markets. The other 30 to 35% is going to, whether it's event planners, wholesalers, going to retailers, going to online orders. Every one of the boxes that comes across the border has to be marked. So the boxes that the wholesaler or the retail florist receive do have the country of origin marking on them. Now, when you call a retail florist and you ask for a dozen roses in a vase, each individual stem, no, there's no marking on those flowers. But that retail florist would be able to tell the customer where those products came from because the boxes they received have the country of origin on them.
Hey, just one final question for you. Let's imagine a flower importer in the United States who wants to ensure that the flowers they purchase meet customer expectations for good labor practices and environmental sustainability. What are the best ways for them to exercise due diligence over their supply chain and to be confident that what their producers tell them is accurate?
So I think there are a lot of certifications that are out there that are very, very good. Flor Verde is one of them. It actually covers half of the production in Colombia and half of the production in Ecuador. That is very high sight of the certifications of what it offers. So I think that if a consumer or customers are more interested in making sure that their products are sustainably grown, and that means labor, environmental, and social, to make sure that they have good, sustainable practices through a certification, and follow through to make sure that they are on a yearly basis being certified. I will tell you, during Valentine's and Mother's Day, there are a lot of the large supermarkets and mass markets that go to the farms in Colombia and Ecuador and actually walk the farms to make sure that the products that they are getting are being held to the standards that they want. So I think that having the certifications is key.
Thank you. So now I have just a couple of questions. I just thought whoever wants to answer, just shout out. And since Dr. Hawkins and Krupa and Stiles are online, I don't see you, so you're just going to have to say, I want to be recognized. But Dr. Stiles and Dr. Hawkins both mentioned grant-funded labor rights programs, including those that focus on research and those that support community programs in the cut flower regions. Beyond regulatory policies, can you talk about the types of civil society or research initiatives that could help improve worker rights and human rights, including any examples that have been successful in the past? So,
if I could
we'll
answer,
go to,
Chairman.
yeah, we'll go to Dr. Hawkins first.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, well, I think a lot of the work that was done to advocate for the Labor Action Plan in Colombia, previous to the actual ratification of the trade agreement in Colombian Congress and the US Congress, was done through a collective group of organizations, unions, both in the US, labor advocacy organizations such as the Solidarity Center, various others in Colombia, the National Union School, Viva la Ciudadanía, various other NGOs that work together to advocate for an improvement in labour rights, regulatory mechanisms, but also putting together research initiatives that could monitor the compliance of the government, the Colombian government, with the 37 points within the Labour Action Plan, which had like 10 overall labour rights themes. So that was very, very important. And then afterwards, most of the ILAB funded projects were focused on enhancing labour rights and enhancing workers' possibility to have their voice actually heard. And this is through union organisation and collective bargaining. Fundamentally, they were focused on the 5 priority sectors: palm oil, ports, mining, cut flowers, and sugarcane workers, all generally in different regions of the country, in different departments of the country, and they all had, just say, systemic labour rights violations, and specifically structural anti-union practices by many employers. So I think that it has been absolutely imperative to be able to activate workers' voice, and then also pressure the labour authorities, the Colombian government, and really pressure for up-to-date information for DOL officials and ILAB officials who were going to do the monitoring meetings, to making sure the investments of US-funded taxpayer money were going to actually improving the labour regulation systems, improving the capacity of the labour inspection system in Colombia as well, to be able to comply with these 37 measures. Of course, we're talking about kind of 15 years since the actual signing of the Labour Action Plan in Colombia. So you had, as I mentioned before, kind of periods where there was good advancement or progress, then a little bit of change, maybe a little bit of stagnation. It also depends on political will, the government in power, all the other initiatives that are being discussed in Congress, and all the other priorities that maybe the Labour Ministry has. But I think the ILAB projects were fundamentally important to ensure that workers weren't just cast aside and it became a regulatory discussion. Or, as Ms. Bolt has mentioned, it's just an initiative from the actual growers and the retailers and the traders to say that, okay, we're complying with our core standards. However, if you don't have workers engaged in these mechanisms, you can't really see if these labor standards are actually being protected, or companies are adopting implicit practices that don't comply with the law or don't allow unions to exercise fully their freedom of association rights. Just one question, just one point on that. For example, I find it difficult to say that there's complete transparency when you look at, for example, Flores in Colombia. It doesn't even publish its members. And if you ask Flores, could you tell us which firms are members of your association? Because Flores is the driver of the Flor Verde certification scheme, and you can't get it. Then there's not this traceability either, in terms of knowing which farm is producing which flowers. If I go into the palm oil sector, for example, one of the other priority sectors in the Labour Action Plan, I can go to the website of PepsiCo, I can go to Unilever, I can go to Cargill, I can go to Colgate, Palmolive, for example, and within 15 minutes, I can get a direct source of where they're purchasing their palm oil from which farm in Colombia in different departments. Now, if we could do that, thinking about workers exercising and really pressuring to uphold their labour rights in the cut flower sector, it would make things a lot better. So why not a little bit more transparency? Why not a little bit more traceability if it's just helping the compliance mechanisms of labour law, and international labour standards.
Thank you. Ms. Gill, did you want to add anything, or, yeah? No, I think we're, all right, let me ask one final question. I open up for whoever wants to answer it, then everybody gets a minute to, to sum up or say whatever you want to say, and then you're free. But I think this has been a very interesting hearing from my perspective, so I thank you for your patience. So the current U.S. administration has argued that the restructuring and cuts that are being enacted in the federal government are designed to make us safer, to make us stronger, and to make us more prosperous. And, from any of your perspectives here, what impact have the cuts to programs and funding for workers' rights and human rights had on safety, strength, and prosperity? Look, this is a Human Rights Commission named after Tom Lantos, who dedicated his life to upholding human rights. So clearly, we all think human rights and worker rights, are important. But we also know that those rights are not protected out of the goodness of governments and people in power. That there has to be oversight, there has to be transparency, there have to be enforcement mechanisms, and so I think sometimes decisions are being made without a thorough airing of why these programs are good or why they're not good, and I open it up to anybody who would like to maybe make the case why, about the importance or the impact of some of these programs, are, in terms of the funding for workers' rights and human rights, and in terms of their impact on safety and prosperity. So, anybody want to take a crack at it?
I can take a crack at it.
Okay, Dr. Stiles. Yeah.
For instance, in Kenya, everything that I'm researching is happening in the aftermath of structural adjustment, where in order to access international aid, Kenya and other countries in the global south were made to drastically reduce their government's connection to those forms of regulation in terms of being able to protect workers' rights, being able to regulate the environment. And so all of those things were sort of rolled back. And what I have seen and written about in my research is sort of an interesting project of trying to roll some of those things back out, but in the interest of kind of the forms of agricultural development that floriculture was a part of. So I guess what I've seen is that because of structural adjustment and because of that, the cancellation of a lot of those programs in Kenya and the dissolution of that kind of whatever, some of the government's capacity to regulate those things, that all of that fell then to the NGO sector and even to the farms themselves. And so sometimes the flower farm owners would say, I care about all this stuff, but I didn't get in to growing flowers so that I could be a human rights NGO. That's not my work, that's not my specialty, but I feel now that because all this is being led through industrial self-regulation, I'm having to do all that work that I don't want to do, and I would actually prefer to see the Kenyan government doing these forms of regulations and deciding how those things should be organized. And so in a way, it becomes a burden. And at first, it seems exciting, even from the point of industry being able to be lifted from the burden of some of those regulations. But at some point, at least from what I've seen in the Kenyan flower industry, that not having that government capacity to do those things itself becomes a burden, and it becomes a problem for them as they're trying to market their flowers abroad. And the idea that consumers have is that anything that comes out of Kenya must have blood on its thorns. I'll stop there.
No, thank you. Anybody else before we go to closing statements?
I had one comment about that. I think that there are a lot of things that are being said and that need to be done, and I think we need to make sure that we continue moving forward with them. No one says anything's perfect. We want to make sure that they are done correctly, and I think what she's saying is that we need to make sure that we continue. One of the things, even to take it a step further, USAID for countries like Colombia and Ecuador are extremely important, but also USDA, United States Department of Agriculture. If we are getting more and more products from these countries, we need to make sure that we have the resources there I mean, I will tell you over the last 20 years, every time we try to work with USDA in the country of origin, oh, they're not there anymore, oh, we're waiting for a replacement, or waiting. How can we maintain and make sure that we're getting the best end products if we don't have someone in the countries of origin to help and make
That's a
sure,
good point,
maintain
yeah.
that? So.
Ms. Gill?
I would just note that the administration has identified forced labor as an unfair trade practice, which we agree that it is. But the best way, the only way to really fight forced labor is through freedom of association and building worker power.
Right.
And without some of these programs, the United States has really limited its ability to do that. These are complex issues, and if our toolbox has been reduced to sticks, the battering ram of tariff threats, we've really limited the ability, I think, to invest in the kinds of work that helps workers,
Right.
It helps supply chains, it helps, resilient supply chains. We all experienced during COVID what it means when supply chains are not resilient. And I think we may see that again. We also know that workplace democracy strengthens democracy. And the United States is more safe and secure when our trading partners are more democratic and secure.
Thank you. All right, so I think, I don't hear anybody else, so why don't I just give everybody an opportunity to say whatever we forgot to ask or make a final statement in a minute. And why don't we begin with Dr. Krupa?
Sure. First of all, just thank you to everybody for this wonderful conversation, and I hope we get to chat again about this. And I guess as my closing statement, it might just build on your final question a little bit to say that there's, at least looking from the purview of Ecuador, it's not just been an elimination of certain types of funding, but an expansion of other types of funding. And so with the reduction of funding for developing just social programs has been an expansion of militarized aid. And so, I think Ecuador is being built up as the next El Salvador, and it's being framed as having a very important role in sort of the hemispheric political imaginary. And I think one way that we would want to start countering that is to offer local funding to domestic human rights organizations and labor rights groups and associations to themselves both conduct research on these emerging intersections between sort of human rights violations related to the militarization of the country and the protection of worker rights within specific industries. And so I would encourage direct funding to local human rights groups who can do that work.
Thank you very much. Dr. Stiles.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this. It's been fascinating to hear everyone's perspectives, and I wish that we could have done this in person and maybe had more time ahead of time to look at each other's statements and think about how they intersect, because I think one thing that I'm taking away from this is that there has always been a need for the people that work in sort of African cut flowers and Latin American cut flowers to get together and to think about how the structures of those industries and the regulation of those industries, if we think together about how they compare, sort of what sort of lessons we can take away from one to aid with the other. And I think, for instance, from what people have said today, I think there's a need for a more focused research project in Kenya looking specifically at the role of labor unions within the cut flower industry and the success of those union-led efforts, which have sort of proliferated and evaporated at different points of time in the place where I work. So there's definitely a need to focus more on that in order to be able to answer some more of these policy-related questions and to learn from the example of Colombia and Ecuador, et cetera. So it's, I hope that some of the things that people have said today will be helpful on that. The Kenyan case study is sort of interesting as a foil or as a way of thinking a little bit differently about some of the things that are happening between the U.S. and Colombia and Ecuador.
Well, thank you. And this is not meant to be a one-off discussion. I mean, I hope these discussions will continue, and if everybody's in Washington at one time, we'll go for drinks and we can have more conversations about how we can move forward on this. Dr. Hawkins.
Thank you very much, Congressman McGovern, and everyone else involved in this panel. I wish I could have been there in person. I think the link between human rights and trade is not something that's just occurred recently. You know, like we go back to the first regulations in terms of trade, which linked worker conditions and workers' rights. We're talking about the late 19th century. I think talking about unionism and freedom of association, collective bargaining as being enabling rights is fundamental to this discussion, because it actually takes all the bulk of the responsibility on the labour inspection system, the labour authorities, to make sure that firms comply with labour regulations away, and workers can actually help monitor and help ensure that firms comply with core labour standards. I don't think any worker anywhere is born a unionist. People become unionists because they see that there are violations and they see that their basic rights and their basic dignity are being undermined. And through that process, they begin to exercise, I think, more fully their civic rights, their democratic rights. I think if you look at all the possibilities that we have presently in legislation, some of them are being undermined gradually, globally, depending on the different sector and the industry. Vacations, social security, minimum wages, occupational health and safety standards, they weren't implemented, as you mentioned, Congressman McGovern, by friendly governments or by firms because they wanted their workers to feel better and live better. They were implemented because there was pressure from below, because workers got together and they decided that enough was enough and they wanted to have more of a say and more of a piece in all the products and all the goodness that they were bringing to the world economy. Now, I think we need to protect workers in environments where the regulatory framework is weak and perhaps the possibility to exercise their democratic voice is repressed or is facing problems. Otherwise, we're going to get to a race to the bottom in labor standards, and that's going to affect US workers. It's going to affect US democracy. So through the Solidarity Center, we don't just work in a particular country such as Colombia with their trade unions and their worker advocacy organizations. We work directly with workers organized in the US who have an interest in protecting worker rights in Colombia and other countries, because that if worker rights are going to be violated there, there's a big possibility that I'm going to lose my job or my conditions are going to be undermined in the US. So I think it's a great initiative to actually bring the discussion of a clear industry where you have production in the US and invite people that have worked in the main exporting countries to look at all the different issues that maybe undermine or implicitly don't allow workers to exercise their full voice. So I congratulate you on the initiative, and hopefully we can discuss these topics and these themes and the proposals more fully at a later date. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Bolt?
Thank you very much. So I want to remind everyone that people love flowers. So
Yeah.
that is the number one thing. But have we come a long way? I think since the 1960s, we've come a long way. We have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who are working in the flower industry. We've provided opportunities for many people. Is it perfect? It's not perfect anywhere, but I think we have come a long way, and we want to make sure we continue moving forward. If we always work together, we can improve. I mean, I work very closely with Asoka Flores, with Ecuador, with Union Flores, which represents the European Union, and they work with Kenya. So there's a lot of opportunity, and we discuss stuff all the time. So having things improve is definitely something we want to make sure that we do. I would encourage everyone, if you've never visited a flower farm, visit it, because there's no way to know better than to see it firsthand. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you. Ms. Gill?
Yeah, I join the other panelists in thanking you for convening this discussion, and thanks to the other panelists for your contributions. You know, I'm also from Massachusetts, and I think about the flower farm that you referenced in Massachusetts that you visited that sort of kicked off this hearing, and the comments by the farm owner about feeling a little bit undercut. And I think I want to bring a supply chain analysis to this discussion, which has largely been sort of about trade. Workers in the global economy are not in competition with each other. Workers in the global economy all feel squeezed by corporations. We know that corporations chase poor regulation and cheap labor. These can be U.S. corporations or global corporations. That pushes wages and working standards down for workers everywhere, workers across the supply chain, workers in the United States, and workers in flower-producing countries. And so while we have some trade tools at our disposal, and I think there are important ways to use them, really fundamentally raising wages, empowering workers to exercise their collective bargaining rights and their freedom of association is going to help workers across the supply chain, whether or not they're at farms in Massachusetts or farms in Colombia or Ecuador or elsewhere. And so, I think really we need to think about what is the role of corporations as buyers in this supply chain as they are in many other supply chains, and hold them accountable as well.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the entire, all the panelists for your excellent contributions today. I learned a lot, and as I said, I don't view this as a one-off. I view this as a continuing discussion, and I also think that this hearing demonstrates that there are people that are paying attention to this issue, and we're trying to make sure that we have the backs of the workers, of the people who are doing the hard work and growing these flowers that we all enjoy and love. So again, I thank you all for being here, and this hearing now comes to an end. Thank you.